So on behalf of the Northwest Editors Guild, I wanted to welcome you all to our July 2020 member meeting. Again, I'm MariLou Harveland, and I'm currently serving as the Northwest Guild Vice President of Member Services. So if you have any questions about or want to request specific topics for an event, you can contact me at the email address that's will be listed on the next slide. And if you have any specific topics that you would really like to see us do, please let me know, and we'll look into that and try to make it happen for you. If we could move to the next slide, we'll see that there are a few guild announcements, not many, before we start with our presentation tonight. The first is to let you know that on Wednesday, July 22nd from 5 to 6:15, board member Aaron Kuzik will be hosting an informal happy hour online next week for those who want to further discuss editing translations. This is a great topic for all of us, and so I know people are going to want to be chatting about it later. And the happy hour will be held again Wednesday, July 22nd from 5 to 6:15. So look for the announcement on the listserv, or you can go to the Guild website where the events are listed. The next announcement is for the next member meeting, and that will be in August. That's August 17th from 5 to 7 p.m. And we're going to host another Perfect It tutorial with the founder. And he is being generous and joining us again and helping anyone who's interested in learning that awesome tool. So if any of you are familiar with using it, it's pretty great. So definitely worth tuning in for as well. And the last announcement that I have is that this year this summer, the Guild Board will be hosting some recruitment happy hours, and we're recruiting for the Guild, or for the Guild Board. And if you're interested in getting more involved with the Guild by serving on the board or volunteering in any other capacity, please stay tuned to the listserv or to the Editors Guild website for informal happy hour events that we're going to be hosting this summer, where you can learn about any kind of available opportunities for serving on the board. And yes, anyone is qualified to serve on the board. So if you're interested, please reach out to any board member if you have questions about board service and you want to try it out. So with that, if we could go to the next slide. And tonight's topic is editing and translation, the inside story of how translation works and why, and insights on how to edit translations effectively and with confidence. And our presenter tonight is Shelley Fairweather-Vega. And without further ado, please give your undivided attention to Shelley for this great presentation.
Well, thank you, MariLou. I'm really happy to be here tonight. My name is Shelley Fairweather-Vega. I want to thank the Northwest Editors Guild for inviting me. You might know that we originally planned to have this talk in person in March, right when the world sort of changed for good, it seems sometimes. So this talk from your March member meeting is actually my very first event that was postponed due to the coronavirus. So it's very distinctive in that regard. But that makes me extra happy to be here virtually with you all to kind of meet you online and finally be able to have this presentation. I'm glad it's working out. I'll tell you a little bit more about myself and about the topic overall here. My name, again, is Shelley. I've been translating since about 2005 as a freelancer completely. I quit my day job in 2012 and switched to full-time freelance translation when I had my second child and we moved here to Seattle that year. I translate mostly from Russian to English and occasionally from Uzbek. That's what the UZ language on the slide is. Not everybody can pick out Uzbek at first glance, but that's my kind of second foreign language that I translate from occasionally. Originally, I translated a lot of journalism, news articles, and then business texts, like marketing campaigns, and also legal documents, contracts, things like that. Eventually, I started getting work translating conference proceedings, scholarly writing from Russian-speaking academics who needed to present at a conference or publish their work in an English language journal. And then eventually I moved into what I spend most of my time doing now, which is translating literature. So I translate poetry, prose, children's books, and often screenplays for movies and for TV. Also, for the last couple of years, I've been the president of NOTICE, the Northwest Translators and Interpreters Society, which is sort of a sister organization to the Editors Guild, I think. We are the local chapter of the American Translators Association, which is our national professional network. I'm also an active member of ALTA, the American Literary Translators Association, which focuses on literary translation. So every year I go to the ATA and the ALTA conferences, promote the books I've translated, network with colleagues. This year we'll do that online, I suppose, like everything else. But that's one of my favorite things about my job is presenting at conferences, meeting colleagues. There are other things I like about it too. One thing is that I learn new things every day. And one day my Google search history can be bizarre and varied. I'm sure you guys get this too, editing different kinds of texts. So one day I'll be searching for everything from the names of horse parts to the names of rivers in China, to medieval torture instruments, and it all makes sense in the context of the work I'm getting to translate. I also love translating because I think it's a creative endeavor. This is a really important aspect of it for me, and one that I'll talk more about during the presentation tonight as well. Especially when I translate fiction or poetry, but for other things too, I'm the one who's creating that final text in English that people are going to read. The original author, of course, came up with the ideas and the images and the characters, but every word in the English version has to come from my brain. It's just the way that the translation works, and it turns out that very few of those words that I generate and put on the page in English are actually dictated precisely by the original text that I'm working with. So those words have to be discovered in a creative process that I go through every time I sit down to translate. And those words, of course, are the ones that people like you get to edit later on. I understand that this last point about translation being a creative process might not be totally obvious to people who are outside the translation world. In fact, with all the excitement these days around machine translation, like Google Translate, for example, I think the idea is maybe spreading that translation is really just a mechanical exercise of swapping words from one language for words in another language. And that it can be done according to an algorithm, or that a computer can do it. But I think that's incorrect, and it's one of the things that I'll talk about tonight as well. In my own career, as I moved into translating texts for publications and books and articles and so on, I began to work more directly with editors. Just like with book authors, when a translator translates a novel or for a major publisher, especially, ideally the book goes through rounds and rounds of editing. So I've had books and poems and articles in my translation edited by copy editors, developmental editors, proofreaders, and often by the authors themselves too, when they have enough English to help me with it. So that's given me, I think, at least a little bit of insight into what your job can be like as editors. And it's made me think a lot about this topic, which is what translators in general wish editors knew about what we do in translation. So that's the topic tonight. But first, I want to talk about feelings and ask if any of you are, scared a little bit of translation. From my own interaction with people editing my work, I know, and from reading comments and reviews by readers of translated texts, I know that a lot of people, and maybe like most Americans who only speak one language, people can have a negative reaction to a text that they know is a translation. For example, some editors find translation to be a scary thing to edit. And this makes sense because it does present some special challenges. A poor translation can sound awkward. We talk about translationese a lot, that special version of English that a translated text can sound like if it's not done very well. So a translation can sound strange, but what if the language is supposed to be strange? How do you know? And how much as editors are you allowed to fix a translation? Especially if you don't know the source language, then what? Then you have no idea what it's supposed to be like, right? How can you edit a translation while respecting the original? These are things that might really worry you when you sit down to mark up a text that didn't start out in the language that you see in front of you right now. Another common response emotionally to translation is skepticism. A lot of people simply don't trust translations. Italian has a famous phrase, traduttore traditore, which means a translator is a traitor. So there's a sense that a translation is always inaccurate, always unfaithful some way, not to be trusted. And then there's also just a general skepticism among readers that a translated book could possibly be any good. Actually, my favorite Goodreads reader review of my first big translated book includes the line that says, "Even though this book was translated from Russian to English, it is worth a read," which is a compliment, but it's also a little bit offensive, right? Because when I thought about it, it just seemed to prove to me that translators really have work to do to make sure our translations are worthwhile, that they read well and they read naturally, because people have this skepticism they have to overcome. But in order to do that, to make a book that reads well, we need help from the whole publishing universe, and especially from editors. So that's another reason I'm glad to be talking with you guys tonight. My goal in this conversation is to find out some ways to bring editors into the mission that we translators have of creating good writing that people want to read in a new language. I want to help you navigate these tricky questions and figure out ways to deal with the scary aspects of translation. Is it accurate? Is it faithful? Is it creative enough, or is it too creative? Those are all questions I hope we can start answering this evening. To structure this conversation, I consulted with some colleagues from a big literary translation Facebook group, and I asked them what they most wish the editors of the world knew about translation. My colleagues came up with an immense number of things, and there was a lot of really good conversation that we had around that, but I've tried to narrow down all of their thoughts and suggestions into 5 main points. 5 things translators wish editors knew about translation. And at the end, I've added 1 bonus point, point number 6, which will be your reward for sitting through the first 5 points here. My hope is that after this presentation, you'll be able to overcome whatever fear or skepticism you might have about editing translations, or at least keep that fear and skepticism down to reasonable levels, and that you'll be able to edit translated texts effectively and with confidence. I'm going to pause right here and catch my breath in case there's any questions that have already come up about the presentation in general.
Okay, we'll let you, like you said, take a moment to catch your breath. Give folks a moment to type in questions if you have them already. Take a look at the chat box to the side and type now if you've got something on your mind.
And I'll stop after the first couple points here. I'll stop again and ask for questions. So this isn't your last chance.
First question in the chat box. First comment is great intro. So good job, Shelley.
Oh, well, thank you.
First question is, so this is largely about editing translated works? Question mark.
Yep, that's the idea. So anything that didn't start off in the language, you're editing it in now.
How did you learn Russian?
I started studying Russian in college. I was studying international relations and the Cold War especially. So I started learning Russian that way. And then I served in the Peace Corps after college, and they sent me to Russia. So that's where I really learned it. And I was living, immersed in the language for a couple of years.
I've got a question from myself, not typed into the box. How long did it take you to become aware of these emotional dynamics that you're talking about? I think it's so smart to start with them. When did you become aware of how those impacted the work you were involved in?
Good question. One way it dawns on you as a translator is the reaction that people have when you tell them what you do. And a lot of the times I'll tell people I'm a translator and they'll say, well, can't Google do that now? Because they think it's this mechanical process that a computer can do by algorithm. And then there's just random comments like the one I mentioned in the reader's review of my mystery novel, that like translations are just kind of funny. They always sound strange. They always sound weird. They're not real writing. They're not, maybe even not even real books. They're kind of a thing you can't really trust. So that's a feeling that's out there, I think, and no one's immune to it unless you live in this translation world like I do full time. Does that sort of answer your question, Sarah?
Yeah. I'm
Okay.
not seeing any further questions come in right at the moment. So Shelley, go ahead when you're ready.
Okay, let's get down to it then. Point number one that I want everyone to go home being convinced of after this presentation is that translators translate meanings, not words. And this, when we talk about Google Translate, is the thing that Google Translate can't do. It knows a lot of words, but it doesn't understand anything about meaning, context, connotation. Words can have multiple meanings. So this is the kind of example that you can find all over the internet if you Google translation fail. And I recommend that you do, because it had me like laughing out loud, falling off the couch when I was looking for the right slide for this presentation. Anyway, this particular translation fail depends on the fact that words have multiple meanings. So the Portuguese word frios usually just means cold as an adjective, but it also means cold things, in this case, cold cuts, I am told. And in English, the word cold also has multiple meanings. It's also the adjective that means you're feeling cold, but it also means like you have the sniffles and want to go back to bed, that kind of cold. So this kind of looks like it's bred with a cold. This is a mistake that obviously someone who is fluent in both languages would never make, but that somebody who only has Google Translate or who only has a bilingual dictionary could easily stumble into this kind of error. Human translators, though, professional translators, at least we hope, are very good at sussing out exactly which meaning you need for one particular, sign in a restaurant or a text. Translators can mix up meanings too, though. Here's another example of from French, also posted on Facebook, which is another good place to find translators complaining about bad translations. In this case, the problem is with the French verb lancer, which looks a lot like the English word lance, which you might imagine that it means, to throw a lance at something or to pierce something with a lance. But in this case, in this sentence, it obviously means to start something, to launch something. This is an example of a cognate problem. So one thing that translators try to do is be very aware of cognates. Lots of languages have them, especially Romance languages like French and Spanish and Italian. Words that look a lot like English words, but don't have quite the same meaning. Close, but not exactly the same. And if you've learned one of these languages in high school or whatever, you probably have a list in your head of words like this. We call them false friends a lot because they're so deceptively similar. But other cognates are more subtle too. The most famous one that people laugh at is this word embarazada in Spanish, which people think means embarrassed in English. A lot of beginning Spanish students will say, sono embarazada, which they think means I'm embarrassed, but actually means I'm pregnant, which can lead to a lot of ridiculous situations. So professional translators, of course, avoid this kind of thing at all costs. We don't make this kind of mistake. But I can imagine a scenario in which an editor, say, who knows a little bit of Spanish, but not quite enough, might take it upon themselves to look at the Spanish original of a translated text and see this word embarazada, and be conscientious enough to look at the English text and say, I don't see the word embarrassed anywhere in here. There must be something wrong with the translation. So that's the kind of scenario we want to avoid by kind of identifying errors based on these false friends and cognates. And another important thing to remember, given that we need to translate meanings and not words, is that dictionary definitions are not always the best solution in a translation. So as editors, what I advise you to do is trust your translator over the dictionary. Your bilingual dictionary might disagree on any particular word with the translator of the text you're editing, but that's okay. Probably the translator, if he knows what he's doing, has extra insight into that word and all its possible meanings, much more insight than the dictionary can give you. Or maybe there's something about the context or the usage that demands an unusual translation. This kind of thing happens all the time. And if you're not sure, if you see something translated from a language you don't know, or actually if you see something translated from a language that you do know, but that it doesn't reflect the meaning that you understand, what you should do is ask the translator, because usually we do know what we're doing. Point number two to know about translations is that translations come in all shapes and sizes. So when we translate and when you edit a translation, it's vitally important to know what kind of translation you're dealing with. When translators first tackle a new job, they have to ask themselves a few questions. one question is, what is the importance of this text? There's a whole range, of course, but it can range from a vital world classic to something that's really just for fun. And then there's, of course, shades in between that as well. If we're doing, a new translation of War and Peace, we better recognize from the start that this book is a classic, right? And that it's been translated into dozens of languages many times over. And we'll need to make sure that we as translators are doing all our research and we have a very good argument for the approach our particular translation is going to take, so that these things on the left side of the screen, notes, research, accurate renditions of style and things like that, become extremely important. And when I translate screenplays for Russian TV shows for kids, for example, on the other side of the scale, I focus more on the appropriateness for the audience of English-speaking kids of a certain age. So I'm focusing on like the audience and the receptivity of that audience more than being precisely accurate, especially in terms of the foreign cultural information that might be included in the Russian version of the show. So some adaptation comes into it and not just strictly translation. Another important question to ask when we're sizing up a translated text is what the purpose of the translation is. Again, there's a sliding scale, so some texts are purely informational and some are more purely artistic, and of course everything in between too. If it's informational, the goal of the translation is for the reader to know exactly what the original language document says. And in that case, the translator will prioritize precision and completeness of information. The translator, again, might add notes and explain things that might be unclear. But if the text is a piece of art itself, then the most important thing to translate is the artistic aspects of it, the sound, style, imagery, voice, and so on. So informational texts require reporting in translation. This happens with scholarly work, research articles, and usually for legal documents or anything that's going to be used for evidence in a courtroom. And on the other hand, artistic texts require a creative approach. So the translator is actually recreating the text and the art in a new language. The most obvious example of that is poetry in translation. A literal translation of a poem is pretty worthless. Here's one of a poem I translated a few years ago. I did not translate it this way that you see on the screen for publication. This is a literal translation I made just for you for this presentation tonight. And it lists exactly what places we're talking about, the Solovki Islands and Kolyma, which were Russian prison camps. It represents every line, every word in every line is in the Russian and in the literal translation. And it doesn't really sound like anything, I have to tell you. It's very English, and the English is correct, it's grammatically correct, and it's complete, precise translation. But it doesn't sound like a poem. But the version that was published is this artistic translation, and it's quite different. I don't know if you can go, it's not easy to go back and forth between the two, but you'll see that this second version has a rhythm to it. Russia sits in prison, lock and key, 30 years, Kolyma, Solovki, and it goes on like that with that rhythm, it rhymes, but it's not really precise. So you see the first version, in the second and third lines, the names of the two places are repeated. Solovki, Kolyma, Kolyma and Solovki. But in the poetic translation, I did not repeat them. Instead, I repeated the prison camp, the word prison in the third line, the prison camps and prison cages. So what I decided to do is translate the repetition in the poem as an artistic element of it, but not translate, not repeat the same words, so that we end up with a poem in English that sounds like poetry. There are also texts, of course, that fall in between these two poles, as I was saying, of texts for information that need to be translated pretty literally, and texts for art that need to be translated loosely or recreated. One example of that is long-form journalism. So the facts are very important, but so is the storytelling. So it requires kind of a mixture of approaches. So translators do ask these questions about the texts they're translating and take them into account while they're translating. And hopefully the editors of these texts will do the same thing. To find out again which kind of text this is, if you can't tell yourself, the best person to ask is your translator, because the translator will have thought about it a lot. we're going to go on to the third thing. And this third point that I want editors to know about translation is a little more controversial, even among translators. There's a real fury on Facebook when we started discussing this one. So it has two parts. And the text, the tenet here is that the original text is sacred and inviolable, but not always. And I think I'm going to argue actually that really not always. It's a contradictory piece of advice, right? And it's really just another way of saying that translation is a complicated thing. Some elements of a text can change in translation to make a better English final product, and some cannot change. This depends on the status of the original, like I was saying before, and the purpose of the translation, and other factors as well, such as what the author wants, whether the author cares, what the publisher wants. And all these things make a big difference in the editing process as well as in the translation process, especially if the editors are looking at both languages, because editors need to be comfortable with a certain degree of violation of the original text, and they need to know how much change is too much change. Now, in some ways, the original can be sacred and inviolable, especially if we're talking about an important work of literature. There are things about the author's style and so on that absolutely need to be reflected in the translation. And sometimes editors of translated books ignore this or forget about it. And they'll set about editing the translated manuscript the same way they might edit a work submitted in English by an English-speaking writer. So editors might be tempted to anglicize the text. They could over-sanitize it and remove un-PC language and references that were in the original. They could have cut parts they think are too long or too boring, and so on. And translators do this too. And sometimes it's called for, but when we're translating and publishing a work of literature, we really need to keep in mind the author's intent and make sure we're editing with a really light touch for that reason. Unless, of course, the purpose of the translation is different, and then the audience will be reading the translation and demanding something else, not so sacred approach to the original text. And in that case, we do adapt the original to make something a little bit different. One of the things that came up in my conversation with colleagues are cases when an editor has tried to make their translations conform to the editor's conception of what a book from that country or that language is supposed to sound like. This woman, Dorothy Potter-Snyder, her pet peeve is that when editors try to edit translated texts into sounding like your favorite author from that country, she says instead they should sound like the author being translated. So we don't want, every book by a new Latin American author to sound like Gabriel Garcia Marquez, for example, just because that's our idea of what Latin American literature sounds like in English. This author has her own voice and her own style, which the translator will try to preserve, and the editor should as well. So original text, not sacred and inviolable at all, I'd say. So that means you don't need to hold your translator too closely to the original if, of course, you're looking at the original text alongside the translation. So that was 3 out of 5 points. So this is a good place to pause for more questions. I saw the chat box flashing a little bit.
That's true. We've had a couple different things come in. The first is an anecdote from David who says, when in Italy, my tourist Berlitz dictionary had me say goodbye to all my friends by saying addio. They all laughed and said, you say that when you're about to die and we'll never see them again. Otherwise, ciao or arrivederci, which means until we meet again. So there's a question from Marilyn Schwartz who says, a translator I know says she receives machine translated text to improve, quote unquote, as a translator and editor with reference to the source text. Is that done now, especially for non-literary content?
It is, yeah, and only for non-literary content, I would think. Yeah, a lot of translators earn a big chunk of their income by doing this, what is called post-editing of machine translation. So people will run, perhaps a very long text through a machine translation, usually not Google Translate, something more sophisticated and more in tune to the vocabulary that's going to be used, and then send it off to a real person to edit it and fix the problems. Some languages that works better than others. So like Spanish to English machine translation is pretty good a lot of the time, but a language like Polish or Mandarin could be, a real mess when you put it through a machine. So it needs a lot of untangling to make everything grammatically correct. So that's a different, yeah, it's a different type of translation, but it's work that translators do quite a lot.
So Erin Cusick asks, I've often wondered, how do you handle translating things like proverbs?
Yeah, that's a good question. And it depends on the purpose of the text. So some kind of folksy sayings in one language are very similar to a folksy saying in another language, and you can just replace one with the other. You can just say, don't put the cart before the horse in English, even if they don't use quite the same images in the original text. But sometimes you want to preserve the original words because you want to teach the reader something about how they say things in Uzbek, for example, which they might not know ahead of time. So it depends how important that one little quip is to the text as a whole. But people have different strategies for doing these things, and a store of stock phrases in our heads a lot of the time that we'll pull out for translations.
Michael Schuler asks, how much information do you need on the culture of the mother language to guide your translation? That is, are there issues that do not need just linguistic translation, but cultural translation as well?
Sure, yeah, cultural information is really important. And often you have enough cultural information to know that you're going to have to adapt as you translate. The example that comes up all the time when I translate cartoons from Russian to English for little kids is the idea of Christmas. So in Russia and a lot of post-Soviet countries, Christmas is not really celebrated, but they moved a lot of Christmas celebrating traditions over to the New Year's Eve holiday. So there's a New Year's tree, and people exchange New Year's presents, and somebody who looks like Santa Claus comes to visit at midnight on New Year's Eve. So when Russian TV shows have their Christmas specials, they're actually New Year's specials. And we end up translating that into Christmas for American and English-speaking kids. But that takes the knowledge that, oh, this is the Russian Santa Claus, this is the Russian New Year's tree. We can pretty much just translate that into Christmas, as long as the visuals that are going along with this text don't have like a calendar showing December 31st, which always throws everything off. Then we have to do more cultural explanation.
What a fantastic example of that.
It can be a pretty fun thing to work with.
There's nothing else in the chat box for now. Let's go ahead when you're ready.
Okay. So we've discussed how complicated translation can be and how the original text isn't sacred, except when it is, and so on. And I hope this has given you a healthy respect for translators. But what happens when you sit down to edit a translated text and it just looks bad? Because this can happen, right? When you find a lot of things you want to question or change, here's my advice for you. Number 4, blame the original. I'm joking, but only half joking. So we had to accept that the initial text isn't sacred, and once we do that, it's easier to accept my next point, that translators can, and usually should, make corrections as they translate, and editors can do that too, if you consult with the translator responsibly first. I often find myself correcting errors in the source texts that I translate. Here's an example from a novella that I've been working on, and what you see here is kind of part of my list of queries that I sent to the author's son, who was kind of serving as his representative for this project. So you see Russian text on the left and English on the right, with the words in question in bold. So on the top here, the problem is that I identified a factual error, and I learned, this is one of my more bizarre Google searches, I had to look up what happens when you mate a horse to a donkey, and it turns out it depends which one is male and which one is female. So the Russian ended up using the word mule, but what we needed was a hinny, which is the offspring of a male horse and a female donkey. So this is a small error that we can just fix in translation, but I wanted to make sure with the author that this wasn't a mistake done on purpose for some reason to show the ignorance of the characters or something like that. But no, it turns out it was just a mistake. So we'll just use a mule. And the next example, the bottom of the screen, is what I would consider a stylistic error in the original one. So they use this word vdruk, which means suddenly, 3 times in the space of 2 sentences. If I was writing like this in my own words, doing my own writing, and I caught myself using suddenly 3 times in 2 sentences, I would probably change it. But again, I wanted to check with the author to make sure this wasn't intentional for some reason. So these are the kind of questions that that come up when I work with an author, and I talk with the author about it. And similarly, if you get a translated text with things like this in it that looks strange to you, you can speak with the translator about it and make sure. One time I translated a mystery novel, the one that was surprisingly worth reading, even though it was a translation. And that was very well edited by a whole team of different editors. And one of them concentrated on factual errors like this. For instance, she noticed one time that at one point in the chapter, it was too dark to read when the characters first got in their car. And then later, after they'd driven for miles, they saw the sun was just starting to set. So this is a logistical error in the original that I replicated in my translation without noticing it. I didn't catch it, but the editor did, which was a great thing. Now, sometimes an editor will identify something in the translation that might not be an error, but just looks weird, like all these suddenlies in a row here. Sometimes it's necessary for stylistic reasons, but there might be a more artful way to do it in English, like a way that doesn't look like a mistake that me as the translator that I haven't just thought of yet. So the best advice for editors, as one of my colleagues put it, is this: if something in translation looks weird, ask whether it's the same kind of weird in the original. Because if the editor, if the original is weird, then the translation has to be weird too. And hopefully it's weird in the same kind of way, or at least a similar way. Sometimes it's weird because the translator made a mistake. But it could be on purpose, and it could be a necessary thing to retain. So when I surveyed my colleagues and asking them about what to tell you tonight, this is one of the most popular pieces of advice that came up. Another colleague even added, this is one of the things that endears certain editors to me. I love a good editor that will first check on this, and second, work creatively with the weirdness. Maybe that's what I want most from an editor, to make the process truly fun by getting into the spirit of the book rather than working prescriptively. A second piece of advice along these same lines is for an editor to ask, what is happening here, rather than asking, what does the original say? And when you phrase a question this way, the first way, what is happening here, it signals to us translators that you, the editor, find something confusing or weird or awkward about a sentence or a paragraph, and that we need to rethink it to make it more clear. Asking what the original says is a little more threatening to translators, I think, because it's as if you're questioning our understanding of the original text and implying that if we tell you what it says, then you can come up with a better translation. Now, that could very well be true, but it's more helpful to us translators and more polite, I think, to just report that a passage is unclear in English. And that's all the inspiration that we translators need to go back to the original and see what we're missing or what we can do better. Here's a marked up translation of mine, in which I think the editor did a really good job of asking what things meant rather than what things were supposed to say. So in the second comment here, she asks who the we is, given what she knows about how the plot has developed so far. And the third comment is her question about a cultural thing that I did not explain in the translation, and that wasn't explained in the original. But she wanted to flag that she didn't understand it, so I would know that I might have to give the readers a little bit of help about a particular piece of information. So this is a good way of approaching edits. So tip number 4 is to blame the original, yes, but also not to let us translators off the hook. We need to be held responsible for making sure the message does get through. So you don't hold the original in too much awe, and don't assume our translations are necessarily perfect reflections of the original, or that we're making everything weird and strange because we're just translators and that's what happens. Just ask us what's happening and how weird things should be, and hold us responsible for explanations until everyone's satisfied. So this leads me to the last of our 5 things translators wish editors knew, and that is that translators are writers. And we want editors to treat us that way, of course. As writers, translators are more than just technicians. We're creative professionals. At least we like to think so, just like you editors are. There's a practical side to our work and a creative side. On the practical side, translators have deadlines to meet. We have reputations to uphold. Those of us who translate books usually have our names on the cover, so we feel responsible for the final product. We're often subject matter experts. So translators of poetry are often poets. Translators of articles about medical research are often chemists or biologists. So they know what they're talking about, or we should anyway, and we take a professional approach to our translations. And then on the creative side, we have to consider all aspects of the text, the style, the register, pace, voice, audience. And we're often recreating a work of art or applying creative thinking to like a legal document, for instance, to make sure every aspect of meaning in the original is reflected in a readable and accurate way in the translation. As writers, we're also pretty tuned into the editing process, I'd say. In a way, translators are a special type of editor ourselves because we're revising and reworking the original text the whole time we're translating it, revising it from one language into another. Most often, the translation you get to edit will be the 4th or 5th draft of our translation after we've rethought and revised the whole thing many times. We often have style guides to follow, and we're often hired to edit other translators' work or to edit machine translation, as we mentioned before. So usually when it comes to editing, translators get it. We understand how it works and what your job is. For the Russian news articles that I translate every week, for example, the publication has like a 60-page style guide that I have to follow that governs everything from the, the format on the page to how to deal with numbers and abbreviations and spellings and things like that. And if I get something wrong from that style guide, the editors who check my work will definitely let me know about it. As writers being edited, translators need to hear your suggestions to know what isn't working. We've read the text a dozen times each in both languages, but we can miss things, obviously. We know we're not perfect and our work needs editing as much as any other kind of writing does. But we also can have fragile egos. So as much as any other writer, translators appreciate comments that are phrased politely, positive feedback, and especially nice passages, and questions that reveal the editor knows this is a translation and also respects the work that translators do. Here's one more pair of examples for you. First is an unhelpful one in which the editor's comment was just a question mark around this phrase, holding the breath of death, which I admit is a strange phrase, but your question mark doesn't give me the information I need to fix it. So I end up just trying to explain everything about it, which you can see in my comment there. And then the editor sort of woke up and said, oh, well, it's a metaphor. I'm not sure that it works. And she talks about her thought process and what suggestions she's got in her head for how to change it. So then we could have a conversation about the phrase and make it better. But in the second case, the same editor had a really understanding comment. So she flagged the phrase plague and pestilence because she considered it repetitive, redundant. But this is a place I wanted to keep because it reflected a stylistic aspect of the original language. This one was from Uzbek, which has a lot of sing-song phrases that are pairs with synonyms. So I wanted to replicate that whenever I could think of a good way to do it in English. And once I explained that to her, that I was trying to keep something about the original style, she was very understanding and said, of course, and no more discussion needed, so we kept it. Let's see. I really enjoyed working with this editor because she's a translator herself as well and had a lot of insight into the translation process, and their press, in fact, only publishes translated books. So she knew what it was like to edit translations and was usually very understanding and easy to work with. So translators, like me, we want to be treated as writers. Please treat us like writers or creative professionals who, of course, need correction and support from time to time. And all this to say, of course, is that editors and translators have the same end goal. We want to make the best article or book or poem possible, and we each bring our own skill sets and expertise to that task. I believe that translators and editors should consider ourselves team members on an equal footing because we need each other. This is your super 6th bonus point. Every pair of eyes on a text helps us see the text in a new way and brings about a better finished product. So we couldn't make good translations without good editors. So thank you on behalf of myself and all my fellow translators for the good work that you do. And thank you for listening too.
All right. We have some questions that have come in through the group chat. We're going to start with those, but then we are going to transition into our networking conversation time. So this is a time when you can fire up your video camera and start unmuting your mics and getting ready for us to just have a chance to talk with each other. I'll start with a question from Betsy Berger in the chat box. You mentioned, Shelley, making sure that the types of weird in the text matched each other. Betsy says, do we use the word weird when asking about a text?
You know, I might not have done it if my fellow translator Dimitri hadn't done it. And I thought it was a nice way of putting it. Is it the same kind of weird? Because it doesn't seem so bad. I guess if I was editing a translation, if I was receiving your edits back on my translation and you said, this sounds weird, I might be a little offended. But there's other ways of explaining that too, of course. And one way of saying that is, you know, what's happening here in the original? What's the effect on the reader in the original? As a polite way of reminding me that I need to have an excuse for making my English sound weird.
Michael Schuler says, I've edited translations and fixed continuity errors and wondered about the original. Is there a process for edits like that to work their way back to the original?
Yeah, sometimes. So often when we find a continuity error, like you said, I first double check the source text, and often it'll be there in the original text. And sometimes they've been published like that by, you know, a Russian publishing house or some other publishing company, and no one has ever noticed, no one's ever said a word about it until we get to our good, diligent, you know, American publishing house editors or their contractors who do a really good job finding those things. And usually when we ask the authors about it, they'll say, oh, I never noticed that. Wow, thanks for pointing that out. Sometimes even if they're going to have another edition of the book or something in the original language, or if it's just published online, they'll just go fix it. But that's thanks to the editors of the translated version who discovered the problem.
In the chat box, David says, when I was a lead editor on proposals, editors who left just the question mark drove me crazy. So some empathy there.
I'm sure it's not just me.
Yeah. I have a question, and that is, I'm not familiar with editing translated works. In the workflow of that whole process, is it most common that when I'm the editor that my main liaison is you, the translator?
That's been my experience, yeah. So the publishing house will have their editors either taking turns or just one main editor. And they'll send comments right to me. And then it's up to me whether I want to go back and consult with the author, if it's a living person I can get in touch with, or if I have to kind of rely on my own resources for answering those questions and making those decisions about changes. But yeah, usually the final text is up to the translator after the editors have a go at it. So we become the ones ultimately responsible for making those decisions based on editorial changes and things like that.
We've got a raised hand from Erin Kusik. Erin, go ahead.
Hi, Shelley.
Hi.
I think I'm unmuted. Okay, yeah. Thank you for this presentation. I work on a lot of translations. It's one of my favorite things to edit. And so this one example, this is a little tangential, but I often see this example of translations. The first line of Anna Karenina tends to be one that people use a lot. I'm sure you've seen it. And they just compare, like, look at how many different varieties there are of translations for this first line of this classic novel. So I guess I just wanted to comment on that and see if you have any feedback on that. And also, just regarding classics, how does, like, say you wanted to translate Anna Karenina, what would your, like, how would you, do you propose that to a publisher, or how does that part of translation work if that's like a passion project or something like that?
Yeah, Anna Karenina, I mean, I went to a whole conference presentation on Anna Karenina once, and the presenters were two translators who had both published new translations of that novel the year before. They were both working on it without knowing the other one was doing it, and now there's two publishing houses coming out with two new Anna Kareninas in 1 year. So articles were written, presentations were given, and it's really interesting. And I learned that I should not publicly express an opinion about that first line of the book because passions run high about it. But there are always lots of solutions to any line, even a really iconic line about every household being, every happy household being alike and every unhappy household being unhappy in its own way, right? Another one that comes to mind is, I think this is the Camus novel, I think it's The Plague or The Stranger. Anyway, the first line is "Mother died today," or maybe "Maman died today." And there's a whole article written about that people find online and share over and over again, because there's so much that goes into that one first word, mother, that makes you wonder how the best way to translate it really is. So it's a really fun conversations to have, even if we never really come up with the right answer. For translating classics, I've never done it. It's really intimidating to me. The closest I've gotten is a poem by a famous poet once in a while. My impression of like the industry around it is that usually it's a publishing house that decides that we'd like to have our own version of Metamorphosis or something like that. And we need a new translator to do it. So every 10, 15, 20 years, people will come up with a new War and Peace or a new Anna Karenina, so that this publisher has something to sell, a version of it to sell. So it's more kind of publisher driven than translator driven. Although translators will also discover, a classic author who they think has been misinterpreted or not portrayed well in translation, and do a new translation that they think uncovers some new aspect of the art of that author that they want to share with the world. So yeah, it can be a passion project too, like you said. Most of the translations I do are of more popular contemporary fiction, so I can stay away from those kind of dangerous territories of Tolstoy and serious authors like that.
I have a question that is maybe related to what you were just explaining. You had spoken earlier about a translator sort of justifying their approach to a new translation of, maybe a work that's been translated often before. Can you describe what that translation approach means?
Yeah, so it can affect all kinds of things. And I think the approach is mostly often centered on the audience. Like, who's the audience reading this book? Is it somebody who's reading it for the first time? Or is it scholars who are looking for a new angle in the work? Most recently, there was a new translation of the Odyssey, I think it was. And the interesting thing about this translation, the first interesting thing was that it had been translated by a woman for the first time. All the other previous translators have been men, apparently. And this woman is a respected scholar of antiquities, and she also took sort of a feminist angle approach to the translation. So she had a new reading of what all the female characters in one of the verses were up to. So originally they had been counted as like slaves and harlots or something, and she saw them in a completely new light that seemed justified by the scholarship around the poem. But she portrayed them in that new light in her translation. And it caused a lot of discussion and had a lot of readers reading that poem for the first time and seeing it in a new way. So retranslating a classic can uncover like new aspects of it that have been neglected before. So that's one thing that can change in your approach. So if she was looking at every word having to do with women in that whole poem and making sure it wasn't being interpreted according to some kind of preconceived notion that previous translators had had about the role of women in that society. And she found new meanings and kind of new attitudes in the piece that people hadn't paid attention to before in translating it. So that's one really good example, I think, of your having a translation approach that's justified.
I want to invite others on the call to unmute and contribute questions or comments if you have any.
I'll put the 6 tips up here again too, in case we need a little trigger for conversation.
I have a question about keeping up with the language. Do you have a favorite? Do you do a bunch of different things if you're mostly surrounded by English during the day? Like, do you have, or how do you stay current in the languages that you work in?
Yeah, so just before I'm translating every day, I'm always reading new things in my source languages. So
right.
There's that, but I do notice that my conversational skills go down here really fast if I'm not using them. So I'll try to listen to podcasts and YouTube videos. It's really easy with, social media to reading Facebook posts in your source language is really educational because language changes really quickly, right? And people use like cutting edge language in their Facebook posts all the time, and abbreviations and slang. So you can pick up a lot of things that way and notice how that language is changing, and that helps you keep up.
Thank you.
We've got a raised hand from Michael Schuler. Michael, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, are there particular translators that you really like reading the work of, or do you tend to read things in Russian rather than read translations of Russian?
I read both. I read a lot of, I try to keep up with the work my favorite colleagues are doing in translation. So my colleague Lisa Hayden does a lot of really interesting books from Russian. And they've all won prizes, contemporary literature prizes in Russia. And she does a great job translating them into English. So I recommend her work. And then for poetry in Russian, Dmitry Manin, who's the author of the quote about weirdness in the translation and weirdness in the original, is a wonderful poetry translator. And he interestingly works both directions, from Russian into English and from English into Russian. Usually translators only work into our mother tongue because that's the language we're most fluent in as writers. But he can do both directions, which is really interesting. So those are two I recommend from Russian, but there are all kinds of translated literature seems to really be taking off right now. It's getting published more often. So, hopefully it's sort of coming into vogue, and there'll be more and more good translators and that are recognized. Household names, maybe we can aspire to that. So it looks like there's nothing else really coming up.
I think there's not. So Shelley,
Okay.
if you've got any final thoughts you want to share with us as we're wrapping up.
No, I'm glad to have been here and be able to start this conversation with you. It sounds like you'll be able to keep talking about it at your happy hour. And I can stick around for a couple minutes too here if there's more questions, or if people just want to have a more informal chat, and I'm happy to stay and talk. I love talking about translation.
That's great. Thank you so much. I am going to ask MariLou if she wants to give us our final closing remarks, and then we will stick around a little bit in an even more informal way, for more chatting if we like.
Well, thank you so much, Shelley. That was really great. This is a topic that I just absolutely love. So it was great to hear it from your perspective. This concludes officially our July 2020 member meeting presentation. If you have further questions or you want to connect with Shelley, please contact her at that information that's listed there on your screen. If you have any questions or have any or need anything, if you want to find out any more information about events that are occurring in 2020, please go to the Editors Guild website, and definitely look for the happy hour that is going to be informally talking about the editing and translation discussion tonight, if you wanted to continue the discussion about this topic. And with that, I'll say thank you again to Shelley. That was great. And thank you all for attending tonight.
Thank you for having me.